Greetings. My name is Dr. Richard Venditti, and I'm going to be giving a talk on introduction to the paper recycling industry, kind of telling you how big it is and how important it is to all of us. First, let's just kind of go over the learning objectives. First, what we'll do is we'll try to understand how much paper we use globally and how much we recycle, and where is the actual flows of the recovered paper going. Second, we're going to identify what are the major groups of paper and what they're recycled into. Then what we'll do is we'll try to understand in the United States how much paper we're recycling. And we'll also discuss what a difference that makes with respect to landfills. And then finally we'll wrap up with a looking at the economic motivation for recycling paper and why does this system work so well. So first, what I'd like to do is talk about how much paper we use globally and how much we recycle. So globally, we consume about 450 million tons of paper per year, and that's a data from 2016. That's a massive number. If we break that down into how much of the paper input material that we use to make the paper, about 1/3 comes from trees. So we take trees, we liberate the fibers in the trees, and we make paper. That would be called virgin fiber. However, 2/3 of the material that we use to make paper is from recycled paper. That's an incredible and significant fraction of the raw material used for paper. So let's try to visualize those numbers. They're so big that it's very hard to appreciate, but let's just go ahead and try and visualize that. Okay, so I'm going to ask this question, kind of interesting question. How many tractor trailer trucks would we need to hold all of the paper that we use globally for 1 year? Okay, and we might even think about that as how long would the line of trucks be? Okay, so some information to do these basic calculations. The trucks are about 80 feet long. There's a picture of one at the bottom there. And they can carry about 22.5 tons of cargo, in our case, recovered paper. All right, and let's estimate that the paper packed as a bale has a density of about 500 pounds per cubic yard. And then finally, another data point that's interesting is the Earth is about 25,000 miles in circumference. Okay, so if we do the calculation, it turns out we need 20 million trucks to hold all of the paper that the globe consumes in 1 year. That's about 300,000 miles of trucks lined up, front to back, front to back, front to back. It would be great if you tried that calculation at home. So let's just kind of put that in perspective. How long would that line of trucks be? Well, that distance that we calculated actually is 12 times around the Earth. So let's just go ahead and do that. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That is the total amount of paper that we consume in 1 year. And those lines right there indicate trucks from front to back all lined up. And that's how much paper we consume. That's amazing. Now let's just think about it. I told you that of all the paper we use, about 2/3 of it come from recycled fiber. So if 2/3 come from recycled fiber, then 1/3 is coming from virgin trees. So now what we can say is how much virgin paper fibers do we need from trees? Well, it would be 1/3 of those 12 trips, so it would just be 4. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So what you can see is that by using recycled fiber, we are saving an incredible amount of input raw material from trees. the next thing I'd like to do is talk about recovered paper production and consumption in different parts of the world. This image shows in black boxes how much recovered paper is produced, and in red boxes shows how much recovered paper is consumed in a certain area of the world. Let's, for example, look at North America. North America is generating about 52 million tons of recovered paper, and it's consuming about 31 million tons of recovered paper. So if you take a look there, there's about a 20 million ton differential. What's happening with that 20 million tons? Well, it's being exported to other parts of the world. In the green circles, you can see the 3 areas of the globe that are actually producing more recovered paper than they're consuming. So the 3 circles, green circles, are places where they're net exporting. In contrast, you can see that the red circles show places that are net importers of recovered paper. So you can see that Asia and parts of the Middle East are importing paper. So what are the major flows? Basically, the major significant flow is that North America is exporting to Asia, and Europe is exporting to Asia. That's the major significant flow of recovered paper. It's kind of interesting what's happening actually. If you think about it, let's think about what happens. In Asia, many products are produced and then they're shipped over to the North America in boats. So those boats come over to North America, they drop off their high valued products, and then the boats need to return back to Asia. Do you think they return back to Asia empty? No. What they do is they return back to Asia with recovered paper. So it's very interesting. The boats are going back and forth from Asia to North America with high valued products from Asia to North America, and then recovered paper from North America to Asia. And a similar thing is happening with transport from Europe. Okay, now let's talk about the major recycling systems. Basically what we want to answer is what kind of products, paper products, are recycled into what kind of recycled products. So first category, packaging material like boxes. We call boxes that have the fluted in the middle, fluted medium in the middle, we call those old corrugated containers, or OCC. Well, one of the major flows of recycled paper is we take the old boxes and we recycle them back into new boxes or recycled boxes. That's one of the major product recycling systems. Okay, now let's say we want to make recycled newsprint. For recycled newsprint, what we do is we use old newspapers, ONP, and old magazines, OMG, not the OMG that we're used to when we're texting, but old magazines, and both of those are combined and then they're recycled into newsprint. The third category is tissue, and of course nobody wants to recycle old tissue back into new tissue, so that's not the case here. What we are going to do though is we'll take printing and writing grades for the most part and we will convert them into tissue. And then the tissue, of course, for sanitary reasons is not recycled or reused. It's typically disposed of in water or in landfills. When we talk about the printing and writing grades that we use to make the tissue, there's a whole bunch of different categories depending on how well they're sorted and how clean they are. And I just throw 3 down here that are very popular. Mixed office waste, MOW, is just what it sounds like. It's waste that comes from offices and it's mixed. There can be quite a bit of plastics and other debris in that mixed office waste. Sorted office waste is a little bit different. The sorted office waste is the waste from the offices, but it's been sorted so that it's primarily just paper. And then you've got mixed papers. These can come from households, offices, anywhere, but these typically have a very, very non-homogeneous amount of papers in them. So they could have a little bit of newspaper, a little bit of magazines, a little bit of boxes, and printing and writing grades. Okay. Then the final category is printing and writing materials. How do you make a recycled printing and writing material? Well, you'd use a printing and writing materials as your source of fibers. So, just to summarize, recycled products typically come from the same products that they were made from, except for tissue, which comes from printing and writing grades. All right, now let's do a little definition here. This is called the recovery rate, and we use this to kind of gauge how we're doing in paper recycling. So the recovery rate, or RR, is calculated as how much tons of paper do we recover divided by how much tons of paper are produced. And you can do this for the globe, you can do this for a country, you can do it for a town, or even a household. All right, let's look at the United States as an example. So we got some data from 2015, and basically the data says that the total paper that's consumed or produced in the United States was 78 million tons in 2015. And then the amount that we recovered total paper in the United States was 52 million. Then we can calculate our recovery rate. If we take 52 divided by 78, multiply by 100%, we get about 66.8% as the United States recovery rate of paper overall as an average. So, something that you could remember, about 2/3 of all the paper that is produced in the United States is recovered. That's a pretty good number, and that compares very favorably to other materials, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now let's look at the trends in the recovery rate over the years. This data shows the recovery rate in the blue dots as a function of year from 1990 to 2015. And what you can see is that the trend is that the recovery rate is going up. And this is for a number of reasons. Some are economic, some are supply and demand for recovered fiber, and some are just governments, agencies, and people just having more desire to recycle and are more willing to put in the effort to recycle. But you can see that that trend for recovery rate went from about 32% in 1991 to about 66% in 2015. That's a significant increase, and that is a really positive occurrence for the environment, society, and the economics. The other thing that this graph shows you is how much paper is recovered as a function of time. And so the bars, the brown bars, show you how many millions of tons of recovered paper. And so you can see in 1991, we're recovering about 30 million tons. And then in 2016, we're recovering about 52 million tons. So here you see that the amount of paper recovered maximized about 2007, and then it's been level for the from 2007 to 2015. So you might ask yourself, well, how did the amount of paper recovered stabilize, but the recovery rate still went up? If you think about it, let's go back to our recovery rate definition. It turns out that yes, the tons of recovered paper right here have been maintained over those years, but the tons that we've produced has decreased. So from 2007 to 2015, we've reduced the amount of paper manufactured in the United States by about 20%. And it's actually the reduction of paper produced that is causing that recovery rate to go up. Some people ask us, is the paper industry going to die off when people stop using printing and writing? Well, actually, it's not going to. In fact, the paper industry is as healthy as ever. In fact, boxes, as most people that order from Amazon and on the internet, the use of boxes is exploding. And then the use of consumer products like diapers and other hygienic products is also increasing greatly. And those usually have a lot of paper fibers in them. And then tissue use is increasing, especially globally. And so there are a lot of different avenues for paper. And really the paper industry is as healthy as it's ever been in a long time. Now let's talk about where recovered paper in the United States goes. As we learned earlier, a lot of the recovered paper is actually used and exported back to Asia. So most of the recovered paper that we have in the United States sent to Asia. The second biggest category is container board. So container board actually consumes quite a bit of our recovered paper. Now, newsprint, you can see, is a very small piece of the pie. Newspapers are declining in popularity, and they're using a lot less of our recovered fiber. And then box board is another type of container board. That's kind of like shoe boxes, any type of folding box. That's using a lot of recovered paper. Think about the backing on your pads of paper. That would be considered a box board or a shoe box. And then another significant consumer of recovered paper in the United States is tissue. And so that's kind of how it breaks down. What is really interesting is the export and the global markets, those have a very significant influence on the supply and demand of recovered paper in the U.S. Okay, so now let's look at the recovery rate for major groups of types of paper. First one we'll talk about are boxes, or OCC. We've got a 95% recovery rate of boxes. And the total amount that we're recovering is about 30 million tons. Those are large numbers. For newsprint, or ONP, we actually have a recovery rate of 73%. So we're doing a very good job in recovering newspapers. And that flows about 5 million tons. As we mentioned before, newspaper use is declining, and that's a smaller part of our recovery. And then finally, printing and writing. We're still using a lot of printing and writing grades papers in offices and schools and things like that. It's about 60% recovery rate, and that works out to be 11 million tons. So let's just kind of put these numbers in perspective. If we try to estimate how many times a box is recycled, let's just kind of do a rough estimate. If the recovery rate is about 95%, we can kind of use that number to estimate how many number of uses of a box. And that would be roughly 1 over 1 minus the recovery rate, where the recovery rate's a fraction. So if we do that, that was going to be 1 divided by 1 minus 0.95. That's equal to 1 over 0.05. That's equal to about 20. That is a very impressive number. So if you think about it, you use 20 boxes. Of those 20 boxes, 19 will be recovered and reused again. That is impressive. All right, now let's compare the recovery rate of paper versus some other common products. So as we mentioned, corrugated boxes, or OCC, are recovered at a 95% rate. Here's newspapers, around 73%, and here's mixed paper, around 60%. And what you can see is that a lot of the materials that we hear about advertising and marketing, things like glass, plastics, are only recovered at about 30%. Paper is recovered on par and even higher than most metals, which are pretty valuable. And the only thing that's recovered at a higher rate are lead acid batteries, because that's the law. You could go to jail if you don't recycle your batteries. So it's very interesting to think about paper. There's no laws that require us to recycle. It's just that it's a really good thing for the environment and for economic purposes. And we'll get to that later. My point here in this slide is that paper recycling makes sense and it's really done well. So let's just talk about, how does society benefit? One way that society benefits from recovering all that paper. Well, everybody's kind of thought about municipal solid waste and landfills and the issues that they create. And the United States is a very, very large consumer of products, and lots of those go into landfills. Landfills are just places to temporarily put stuff. It's a problem that really doesn't go away. You can see mountains and mountains of this garbage that is landfilled every day. The map on the right just kind of tells us a little bit of, it has two major points. Well, first one is that those colored areas are where methane is being emitted from landfills. And the other thing that you can see that it's pretty intense. But what's even more important from that is that the pollutants are actually near where people live. In other words, we landfill garbage very close to where we live, and the reason is economic. We can't transport garbage very long distances and have it be cost effective. So our landfills are where we live, and so the pollutants that are coming from those landfills are also where we live. Wouldn't it be good to reduce that landfill, have more clean areas near where we live? Paper has a very, very important role in that landfilling. So let's just kind of look at what is municipal solid waste. What is by material going into that we dispose of as a country? If you take a look at the pie, what you'll notice is that paper is about almost 1/3 of all the material that goes into that is municipal solid waste. So it is a very significant player in what's happening with the flow rates going into our landfills. The other thing that you might notice is that there are other natural materials, for instance, food scraps, yard trimming, wood, rubber, leather, and textiles. All these things are organic, and if we can find ways to maybe compost them, burn them, or use them in a better way, then what we can do is we can solve about 75% of the landfill. There are other things like plastics, metals, and glass in there. And of course, if we could find cost-effective ways to recover those, then we could almost eliminate landfills. But right now, the cost-effective method in what we're doing is putting a lot of material in landfills. Now, this graph right here shows us how well we're doing in diverting paper from landfills. What we have here is the amount of paper recovered. That's in the black dots. And what you can see is that in 1994 or so, we recovered about 40 million. And as we said before, now around 2015, 2016, we're recovering about 52 million. At the same time, we're not using as much paper. So what's happening is our paper recycling industry is working very well and effectively, and we're not using as much paper as we did before. What is the net effect on paper going to landfills? All right. So the blue data shows us how much paper we're landfilling per year in the United States. And what you notice is that back in 1996, it was about 38 million tons of paper to landfill, and then it was steady for quite a while. And then around 2007, when we stopped using paper, we still continued to recycle at very high rates, which was great. But the amount of paper that we put in the landfill decreased down to about 20 million. So let's just think about that. This is a material that in the last 20 years, we've basically halved the amount that's gone into the landfill. That is an incredible story, and that is a very significant occurrence and a benefit to our society in the U.S. So let's just kind of think about how that savings impacts landfilling in the United States per year. Let's just say that we recycle about 50 million tons of paper every year. Now let's try and convert that into a number that we can kind of understand for landfills. Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to convert that 50 million tons of paper into, again, we're going to use a tractor trailer truck, and we're going to estimate the area that we can save that we save every year by recycling 50 million tons of paper. Okay, so each truck we're going to estimate can hold about 22.5 tons of paper, and each ton is about 10 feet wide and 80 feet long. So we'll use that in our calculation. So if we go ahead and do the calculations there, and you should try it at home, you should come up with, every year we save 63 square miles of, let's just say, trucks parked in a certain area. All right, now let's kind of put that in perspective. 63 square miles, what does that mean? So if we look at the city of Raleigh, and I have a map that's approximately the size of Raleigh, which is about 140 square miles. Raleigh has a population of 500,000, just to put it in perspective. Let's go ahead and put that 63 square miles right on that map. So if we were to just dispose of in landfills using this truck estimation, the black box, the gray box right there, shows us the area covered by landfill. And now you can kind of get an idea of what recycling helps the United States with. It saves that much area in these trucks every year. Now you might say, well, that seems like a small amount compared to the entire United States. But when you start to think about it, I told you that we landfill waste where we live. So the areas around our cities and where we live in our towns, it's very, very limited. And if you think about it, every single year we're consuming areas like shown in this graph, but the areas that we're consuming are very close to where we live. This is a very, very critical occurrence. So what I'm trying to say is that 50 million tons of paper that we recycle, it conserves landfill area in a very, very, very significant way with a great benefit to society. All right, now the last topic that we'll discuss today is, why is paper recycling so effective from an economic standpoint? Glass should be recycled at 100% if we wanted to decrease landfill space, but it's not. It's because it's not as economically favorable. Now let's think about paper. What is the driving force for recycling paper from an economic standpoint? All right, so this graph right here shows some prices from January 2012 to January 2014, and we've got two groups of prices. The prices on the bottom are recycled grades, so recovered paper. So for instance, white cuttings, those come from converting operations where they're making envelopes, and the scraps are called white cuttings, and their value is pretty high, $300. Then we have OCC, old corrugated containers, so those old boxes, and you can see that their price has been around $150 to $200. That's been pretty steady for a while there. And then we've got sorted office paper and in the purple, and then we've got old newspaper in the light blue. And what you see is that the prices of these recovered papers, it ranges from about $50 to about $400 in some cases. So that's the value of the recovered paper. Now, why is that important? Well, let's talk now about prices of paper. So here are some paper prices. What you can see that the paper prices, they range from about $600 to about $1,100, with copy paper being around $1,000. And then we have de-inked pulp, which is used in a number of products. We have liner board used for boxes and newsprint. And what you can see is that these prices are much higher than the recovered paper. So these dark arrows that are shown here, for instance, this one right here, kind of tells us about newspaper. We can collect ONP and buy it on the market for about $50. If we are clever enough and recycle it, we can sell that same amount of newsprint for about $700. So this differential right here is the main economic driver for recycling paper. Let's take another example. Let's do liner board, OCC. So we make new boxes, and that liner board that we make the boxes is about $750, and we can safely get OCC, or old boxes, for about $200. So here you can see there's a difference of about $500. We take the OCC, we do manufacturing to recycle it, and then we sell the recycled liner board for $700. These arrows are the pumps that actually make people economically want to recycle. Now let's kind of look at the whole cycle for paper. What has to happen is, first, consumers need to use the paper. Then they put it in a recycling bin, maybe in a company, an office, a store, or a home. Then there are haulers and collectors that collect all that. Then they send them to brokers. The brokers actually might sort them, might bale them, and then they sell them to paper mills. Okay? The paper mills make the paper, and then the paper is used again by the consumers. So we have this very nice cycle, and we have all these stakeholders in it. Now, for the recycling loop to work, all these stakeholders have to, if it's their job, they need to make some money. Okay, so what you can see is that sometimes offices, stores, and companies, they will get maybe $20, or even governments, they will get $20 for a ton of waste paper that they put in bins. Then the hauler that transports the paper to the recovered paper brokers that collect it and haul it, they'll get another $20 for the trucking of the material to the recovered paper broker. The paper broker is going to buy that paper, and they're going to actually sell it for a higher value. So they might sell it for $100 to the paper mills. There's another trucker that takes it to the paper mills, and then the paper mills can make $200 to $400 in value, what we saw in the previous slide. So each one of these important people in the stakeholders, they're all making a profit. They're all getting value from this cycle. The only one that's not getting value from the cycle, like from a dollar standpoint, is the consumers of paper. And really, the consumers of paper are a critical link to this. Without them, this doesn't work. However, society now and consumers, they are intelligent, they understand the value of an environment, and they understand what we talked about in conserving fiber inputs for paper and landfill space. And most people are very conscientious about putting paper in the recycle bin. And some of them have personal motives, and there's a plus or minus. You've got some lazy people that don't make the effort, and you've got some other people that are really motivated to do what they can to help society. But really, I want to leave you with that consumer of paper. That's the one link that really we have to, that just is motivated by doing the right thing. Now I'd like to just kind of summarize what we discussed in our lecture today. First point, we use a lot of paper, 450 million tons globally per year. And the way you can visualize that is if trucks were filled with paper, the line would wrap around the globe 12 times. It's an amazing and immense amount of paper we use. Now, when we talk about recycling, 2/3 of all the material that we use to make paper comes from recycled fibers. So that's a huge quantity. And if you think about it, what that does is it reduces our demand of raw materials by 2/3 for paper. Now, most recycled products, we talked about, when we recycle a certain paper group, we usually recycle it back into the same kind of products. So for instance, boxes go back into boxes. Printing and writing go back into printing and writing. Old newspapers go back into recycled newspapers. Tissue is the one exception. And for hygienic reasons, we do not recycle the tissue back into tissue, but we typically use printing and writing grades to go back to tissue. Okay, so in the United States, we recycle or recover about 50 million tons of paper every year. And when we break it down into the groups, what you can see is that the recovery rates are extremely high. 95% for container board, almost 80% for newspapers, and 50% for printing and writing papers. These are very high levels, and they compete very strongly with the recovery rates of, let's say, plastics and glass. The other thing that we learned was paper recycling decreases waste to landfills in a very significant way. In the United States, if we took all the paper that we're recycling now, we put them in trucks and laid them out on the ground, that would take about 60 square miles of area. And the problem with that, one of the problems with that, is that we landfill waste very close to where we live. And so all the environmental impacts really strongly impact the people that live around those landfills. And so paper recycling is a very, very important way of conserving landfill space. Then the last thing we found out was that there's this loop in paper recycling. There's many stakeholders, and each stakeholder has to derive some monetary value in order for them to decide to participate in paper recycling. Now there's one exception, that's the consumer, and the consumer is a critical cog. It's one of those links that if broken, the whole paper recycling system breaks down. But consumers actually are becoming better educated. They're becoming more aware of how their waste impacts the environment. And they're motivated by government and news and trying to keep the environment, the globe healthy. And so we have very good participation by consumers. It could always improve, but currently we're all doing a great job in recycling.